Good morning. Thank you for joining us for the final webinar in our Transbasin Diversions series, offered as a partnership between the Colorado Water Congress and the Colorado Foundation for Water Education. We would like to thank our presenters and our members. These presentations are made possible by your support. As attendees, you will be muted during the panel discussion. Please type your questions into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be on the side of your screen. We will take 2 breaks during the discussion to answer your questions, which we will read aloud for presenters to answer. Without further ado, Dan Lukey, our moderator and a water resources expert, will introduce our presenters and discussion on changing perceptions of transbasin diversions.
Thank you. We're really fortunate today in that we have with us 2 of the true experts on water in the state of Colorado, if not the entire West. Eric Kuhn, who is the director of the Colorado River Water Conservation District, and Jim Lockhead, who is the manager of Denver Water. The format that we're going to use is we have 3 major areas that we want to discuss today. One is changing perceptions of transbasin diversions. The other is the relationship between transbasin diversions, the Colorado Water Plan, the cooperative agreement, and other issues that arise in that area. And the third is the future uncertainties associated with transbasin water diversions. And the way we'll approach this is we'll ask a question of one of the participants here, one of our panelists, give him an opportunity to answer, and then go to the other and move along until we accept questions from the audience. And Jim, I think that we'll start with you. And the major topic being changing perceptions, and then associated with that, some of these subheadings that we have discussed before. And I'll let you lead off. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know, frankly, that there has been a major change in perception on trans mountain diversions. And where I'll start with is after the Two Forks veto. And in the wake of the Two Forks veto, Denver Water certainly had to take a different perception, but so did other Front Range utilities. And what you saw was the beginning of a dialogue between the Front Range and the East Slope. It really kind of started in the days of the Governor Lamb Metro Roundtable, where those dialogues began, and has resulted in a series of agreements, including the Upper Eagle MOU, Upper Colorado River study process, Wolford Mountain. The list goes on. The East Slope and the West Slope even collaborated under an agreement to provide equal shares of flows to endangered fish species under the Endangered Fish Program on the Colorado River. So really, in the post-Two Forks era, it's been marked by a series of conversations and a series of dialogues in a growing partnership, I would argue, between the East Slope and the West Slope. I think that's been accelerated and strengthened with the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement and the Windy Gap Agreement that involved, both of which involved a wide array of parties and a whole agenda of different subject areas that those agreements addressed, and that perhaps the breakthrough, if you will, particularly with the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, is the idea that not only is there a partnership, there's benefit for both the East and the West Slopes, but we had a goal of actually making the Fraser River better off with the project than without the project. And the project allows for flexibility to actually provide enhancements over and above the mitigation requirements. So I would argue that rather than changing perceptions, there has been an evolution of dialogue and partnership between the East Slope and the West Slope, and a growing understanding of the needs of the issues that we deal with in water project development and trans mountain diversions.
Thank you. Eric, how do you see things from the other side?
I see the situation as very similar to the way Jim sees it. But I would add that when I look back 80 years ago, which we're heading in 2014, 2015, 80 years ago, the state was involved in a very intense dialogue. The Water Conservation Board didn't exist. The River District didn't exist. Denver Water, of course, existed. And that was, those discussions were held under the purview of the statewide water subcommittee of the State Planning Commission. And their goal at that time was to bring about some sort of consensus and peace so that Colorado could share, if you want to call it, in what they saw would be a future of federally funded water projects. Of course, the triggering event at that time was the Colorado Big Thompson project. But they spoke more than about the project, the CBT. They were looking at the Gunnison, Arkansas project. Denver was quietly working on its Moffett system. But at the time, there was I think, a general perception, and the reality was you could go reach out relatively close to the Front Range, go across Berthoud Pass or Loveland Pass at the time, and you could find a dam site and a water supply. Today, what's different about it is that those projects that we built in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s essentially command most of the water that's easy to get by the Front Range. So as we move into the future, the complexity has gone up by an order of magnitude. Same issues, the same general conflict between the East and West Slope, more parties, but it's just much more difficult to accomplish what was accomplished 80 years ago because of the geography. I put it this way: the easy projects, and they were never easy, they were always very, very difficult, but those quote easy unquote projects are already built, and this next generation that we're talking about are much more complex, much more expensive, and an order of magnitude more difficult for both the East Slope and West Slope to get their hands around.
It sounds like what you're saying is that the politics have changed some, but what really has changed is the economics and physical availability. Is that it? And could you give us just a bit more detail on that, if that's what you're thinking, and then how that relates to a desire or willingness to cooperate?
Well, it's going to do two things. I think it's going to make the classic big project, if you're looking for a Colorado Big Thompson project or a Fryard project, divert anywhere from 60 to several 100,000 acre feet per year. To find that kind of project, you've got to now go far out into the west. You can't go to Summit County. You can't go to Grand County. You can't go to the headwaters of the Roaring Fork or the Colorado to get those kinds of projects. You got to go to places like Maybell or Flaming Gorge Reservoir or downstream of Blue Mesa Reservoir. And by doing that, by reaching out farther to the west, you do two things. You make your project is much, much more expensive. It's much more difficult to permit. And the farther you go, I think the farther I look at it as sort of an arc. The bigger your arc is, the more people you have within that arc that may not like the project. And so it just becomes that much more difficult to get. So what that's forced us to do, that reality, I think, has forced us to look at the real things that can be accomplished, and that's what the CRCA does. Moffett system has been around for 80 years. What the CRCA did was allow Denver to make a better use of an existing project.
And when you say CRCA, are you talking about the cooperative agreement?
Colorado River Cooperative Agreement. And so the kinds of agreements that we've reached in the last 20 years have basically accepted the reality that the headwaters are, for the most part, fully developed in the classic sense. And now what we're doing is we're making better use of existing supplies. And from a West Slope perspective, we're sort of backing the clock up, and we're undoing some of the damage that we did through these transmountain diversions 50 to 60 years ago. So that's the change there are still people out there that want to go to Flaming Gorge Reservoir and build a 500-mile, $10 billion project. But the more likely scenario is we're going to figure out how we can provide new sources of supplies of fresh water that could allow us to do reuse projects and get, for a 5,000 acre-foot diversion out of the west slope, we could get 50,000 acre-feet of supply on the Front Range. So that's what's changed. It's the topography, it's the geography, it's the supply that was easily there 80 years ago or even 40 years ago is now spoken for, and it's going to force us to do new kinds of projects and new kinds of cooperative agreements.
That's really what I was essentially saying, the same thing in terms of the post Two Forks era. It's been more of an incremental approach that is situational specific, that is building on existing infrastructure. Those conversations will continue. There's a provision in the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement by which Denver Water and the West Slope parties agreed to sit down to look at the development of another increment of water supply. And I agree with Eric. I mean, there's certainly nothing in active planning for sure that is in the traditional sense of a major Trans Mountain diversion project. And what I see is a continued working relationship and a continued incremental and more flexible and adaptable approach to water supply development. We'll get into this, but we also need to think about the dependence on Colorado River supplies on our ability to reuse water and conserve water, and what are the buffers with the advent of climate change. Those kinds of conversations, I think, are the direction of the future, as opposed to the traditional approach of just going out farther and farther and farther and finding new water supplies.
Both of you have mentioned reuse, and I expect most in our audience know the difference between native water and transbasin water and what that means, but I'd like you to just take a moment and explain why that comes into your conversation on transbasin diversion.
Well, of course, any transbasin water is fully consumable and reusable, which means that from Denver Water's perspective, if we can fully reuse an acre-foot of water from the Colorado River, that can generate 4 to 6 more acre-feet of water within our system as that water is continually reused. We have a recycle treatment plant where we take reusable supplies, treat it, and deliver it back into the system for irrigation purposes. Of course, Aurora's Prairie Waters Project is premised on the ability to reuse water that's imported from the Arkansas and from the Colorado River. Denver Water reuses water through exchange, where we'll take Colorado River water and exchange it for South Platte water higher up. So there are all kinds of different ways by which water can be reused. Native water, South Platte water, or if you're in the Colorado River water, is essentially spoken for. Your return flows, there are water rights that are downstream that are dependent on those return flows, and so you only get one shot at it.
And wasn't this a central feature of the negotiations on the cooperative agreement in terms of how that reusable water was used and where it could be used? It seems to me that there was a question between West Slope interests and Front Range interests on just that issue. Is that the case, and can you explain it a little bit, Eric?
I believe it's the case, and essentially where the West Slope has been for many decades is if you're going to, on the East Slope, if you're going to import West Slope water to the Front Range, you need to make successive uses of that. You need to use it and reuse it. Big exception being the Colorado Big Thompson project, which has its own sort of history that involves using that water all the way down to the Platte, to the Nebraska state line. So with the exception of that project, the goal of the West Slope has always been, if you're going to import water from the Colorado River Basin into the Platte, you should reuse it to the extent that's both practically and legally possible. And one of the things that Denver does commit to in that Colorado River Cooperative Agreement is their best efforts, if you want to call it, to reuse their water. And from what I've seen recently, since we've negotiated the Colorado River Cooperatives, Denver has gone beyond what we anticipated they would do under the CRC, under the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement.
Do you agree with that, Jim?
I do. I mean, I think that's the reality that cities throughout the world are dealing with. You look at the recent commitment by Los Angeles to reduce their dependency on imported water and develop renewable supplies. The big challenge that we have in the future is, frankly, getting out of our own way in terms of our ability to efficiently use water and reuse water. A lot of the tools that are being developed by cities throughout the world, such as that include green infrastructure, rainwater capture, reuse technologies, are very difficult in today's Colorado water rights and regulatory environment. And so the uncertainty from a utility perspective is, will we have the ability to move in that direction, or will we be forced into essentially the status quo, which is new water project development or going to ag buyout?
And I guess we have the stamp of approval on that now with Bill Gates on the web drinking a glass of recycled water.
There you go. Yeah.
What more could we want? One more on just this issue. I've always felt, and I would like both of you to comment on it, that one of the infrastructure projects that changed the nature of the relationship between the Front Range and the West Slope with respect to water was not a water project at all, but the Eisenhower Tunnel. That changed the economics and the relationship in economic terms between the Front Range and the West Slope, and ultimately gave the West Slope more leverage than it might have had. And should I stand to be corrected on that? Am I just making that up, or is that so?
I think that's right. I will put it in a more simpler way. I think what the Eisenhower Tunnel did, and to a lesser extent even the improvements on Berthoud Pass, is that Grand and Summit counties have become in some ways the mountain suburbs of the metropolitan area. They're a little more than an hour away because of that. So there's this economic now dependence between both the Front Range and the mountain communities, and between Summit County and Denver, or between Grand County and Denver. So it's integrated. It's those communities from an economic perspective, and that wasn't there 50. When I look at the history, that wasn't there 50 years ago.
I'm not going to call Grand and Summit counties a suburb of Denver. I'm not going to go there. And I know that Eric has spent his share of time on I-70, and I lived in Glenwood Springs for 30 years and spent my share of time on I-70. And I do agree that Colorado is a lot more economically interdependent, socially interdependent than it used to be. And that closeness and that recognition of the Front Range, that we are inextricably tied to a healthy West Slope, healthy recreationally, healthy environmentally, healthy economically. If the West Slope isn't healthy, then the Front Range is not going to be healthy, and vice versa. And so as we look at the development of additional water supplies, we need to recognize that interdependence, that intertwined social fabric that we continue to have, and develop water supplies in a way that are sensitive to those realities. And so I do think that's been a big factor in fostering these discussions. And I do spend a lot of time in Grand and Summit counties. Really, the dialogue that was fostered by the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement has resulted in partnerships between Denver Water and Grand and Summit counties at all kinds of different levels. Of course, we have employees that live in those counties that are part of the social fabric in those counties. We have operational and dam safety and other needs where we're working on a day-to-day basis with first responders in those counties. we own a lot of property in those counties. We own water rights in those counties, and we work with them literally daily on various issues. Dillon Reservoir is a huge recreational amenity in Summit County. We provide water to ski areas in Summit County, in Grand County. We work with municipalities. Part of the CRCA involves money and water for water treatment and dilution flows of local water and sanitation districts. So it's much more than just build a water project, divert water, and deal with the impacts. It's an ongoing partnership and working relationship. And again, if it doesn't work on both sides, then we failed.
Well said. Well said. Let's move on to one of the other major topics right now, and that is the Colorado Water Plan, the Cooperative Agreement, and the Colorado River Compact, and the way those play against this question of Transbasin diversions. And this time we'll start with you, Art.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan. And again, I kind of try to put this in perspective and look back that 80 years ago we were having this debate over the future of the Colorado Big Thompson project and Trans Mountain diversions and economic opportunity. Again, 80 years ago, the Front Range and the West Slope had some very difficult discussions. But they ultimately came to an agreement that was sometimes called the Delaney Principle, and that was that the West Slope should allow and should be recognized that the East Slope had the right to take water that was surplus to the West Slope's needs. So we bring in this comment of surplus water. But by surplus, what they meant was surplus to our future economic opportunities. And in those days, it was largely irrigated agriculture, but when you look at Senate Document 80 and other documents, recreation and environment, we're there.
Would you just take a moment on Senate Document 80 and what that is?
And Senate Document 80 was basically the political agreement, the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement of the time between the East Slope and West Slope that allowed for a unified support for federal legislation to authorize the Colorado Big Thompson project. So it was sort of it was a cooperative agreement among the political leaders at that time that allowed that major project to move forward. But today, we're still talking about surplus water, but there's been a paradigm shift. And instead, I believe what the IBCC, the Interbasin Compact Commission, compact issues, that we're trying to reach an agreement where existing users of Colorado River water, including Trans Mountain diverters, would agree that there could be additional development of surplus water, but the definition of surplus means that water that could be developed in a way that doesn't threaten the certainty of our existing supplies. When I say that, I mean certainty. Everyone needs certainty. That's the reason we have a water rights system, is to give mining communities, agriculture towns, certainty of supply. And the Colorado River Compact, like all of the other compacts, provides uncertainty because we have certain obligations to downstream states. So our water supply is only as good as our ability to meet our compact obligations. And Jim talked about the need to reuse, and I look at down the road, if we allow our existing supplies that are subject to being curtailed or shut off because we're not meeting our compact obligations, then not only can they not divert water out of the Roberts Tunnel, they can't reuse that water that they divert for the Roberts Tunnel and the system. It's the first domino falls, and then you get a lot of chaos. So we're now looking at how do we provide certainty with that compact and the hydrologic uncertainty associated with climate change. How can we move forward and figure out a way that if there's surplus water out there, it's available for our future East Slope and West Slope needs in the Colorado River, but do it in a way that doesn't hurt existing users.
I'm sure your comment on this is going to take more than a minute or two, but we're going to take a break right now for questions. And we will turn to Caitlin and Fiona.
So we have 3 questions here, and if anybody has any more questions, please feel free to type them into that questions pane on the right-hand side of your screen. The first question is from Brent Gardner-Smith, and it is, given the relatively pristine nature of the Yampa River, how feasible is it that a large dam and reservoir on the Yampa River at Maybell would ever find acceptance? Didn't we protect the sanctity of the Yampa when the proposed Echo Park Dam was traded for Glen Canyon Dam? This is actually a lot of questions. If future large projects for the Colorado River have to reach very far out, then should a changing perspective for future large projects to look instead to the Missouri or Mississippi rivers, which have been viewed in the past as far-fetched?
Well, this sounds like a thesis question for someone.
Oh, sorry, that last one was part of a separate
The separate question, okay. But
just the first 2 about the Yampa.
Jim, we'll let you answer that first.
Well, I don't know that anybody's thinking about a dam at Maybell, so let me dispel that myth right off the bat. As I indicated earlier, the realities of what I'll call a traditional big project approach, whether it's a Flaming Gorge pipeline or a dam at Maybell or a pipeline to the Mississippi River, is, I don't think, part of today's reality. We have, if we manage our supplies correctly and flexibly and adaptively, there is, I think, plenty of water to deal with the growth challenges that we have and the environmental challenges that we have in this state, in this region. There's a lot of water that's being used by agriculture. If we can have a partnership with agriculture to increase efficiency in the agricultural sector, develop flexible mechanisms to keep agricultural economies healthy, thriving, and be able to share water between cities, agriculture, and the environment, I think there are ways we can do that. So I would argue that it's going to be a long time, if ever, that we really need to be thinking about these kind of major projects. Frankly, they are so enormous, and in an era of climate change, where we're sensitive to energy demands, I'm not sure that it's even reality.
Eric.
Well, obviously, I'll let Jim say that. I mean, I totally agree with him. But I also will comment that the nature of the water business is there will always be somebody out there who's going to be proposing a new and bigger project. And like I say, the hundreds of the projects that were built in 50 years ago that cost hundreds of millions of dollars now cost tens of billions of dollars. And if it's not Maybell, maybe it's the Yukon River. There's always going to be someone who's going to be proposing those kinds of projects. But I cannot envision that a board member on the Front Range of a Front Range Water District or a city council member of a Front Range community would easily make a decision to commit their community to spend the billions of dollars necessary to participate in one of these projects with all of these hydrologic and legal uncertainties that are out there and are only going to get worse in the future.
And I will say that I guess my view is perhaps driven by my optimism that we can develop systems to be able to take this more incremental and adaptive approach. If we essentially allow the existing legal and regulatory framework, which is essentially static and premised on preserving the status quo, to essentially trump our ability to manage our systems more flexibly, we may be driven to the lowest common denominator, which is going just to buy and dry or to the traditional project approach. So I guess I remain hopeful that we can figure out a smarter way to do things.
Another question, Fiona?
Yes, let's do one more. This one is from Dave Tossick. If future large projects for the Colorado River have to reach very far out, then should a changing perspective for future large projects to look instead to the Missouri or Mississippi rivers, which have been viewed in the past as far-fetched? So that was that last one that I read earlier.
I think that
We
you answered that one. Yes.
I think it's always easier to go to solve your problem by creating another problem farther away.
Okay.
It's a good
so
philosophy.
It is a good philosophy, yes.
So then our next question is again from Brent. The Front Range often mentions that a new TMD is needed in order to avoid further buying and drying of farms in the South Platte Basin. With all due respect to the farming community, what is the real downside to buy and dry, other than changes to an ag lifestyle? Should we try and protect an ag lifestyle on the east slope by threatening a recreational lifestyle on the west slope?
Jim?
I think there are lots of reasons to work hard to preserve the agricultural. It's not just a lifestyle, but it's an economic issue. It's part of what makes Colorado's agricultural background and rural heritage is part of what makes Colorado Colorado. It's part of our environment, it's part of our culture, and it's certainly a part of our economy. Denver is the highest producing ag county in the entire state, and that's because of our dependence to agriculture for processing and production. With a growing demand in urban areas for locally grown foods, for example, there are just all kinds of reasons to work with the agricultural economy to make sure that it stays viable and healthy. We just need to figure out ways to allow agricultural producers to realize the economic value of their property right in water by creating a market-based mechanisms to allow them to be able to participate and realize that value. And I believe that we can do that in a way that actually will enhance their economic viability rather than detract from it. So buy and dry is more or less a zero-sum game. I think that if we can incentivize more flexible approaches, we can get beyond a zero-sum game and have winners on all sides.
Eric?
I have nothing to add. Okay. Jim said it well.
I agree. Okay, we're going to go back now to the question I directed at Eric on the state plan, the compact, and the cooperative agreement, and the way that relates to Transbasin diversions or the future of Transbasin diversions. Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of misperception about Colorado's risks under the Colorado River Compact, and that is thrown up as a way to just say no, to say that we don't make the blanket statement, we don't have any water left on the Colorado River Compact. Any water use will increase our risk of violating the compact, and so therefore you can't do anything. We've had a fundamental shift in the strategy that Colorado and the other upper basin states have taken with respect to the compact. For a long time, we were looking at the compact and our obligations to the lower basin, and we were saying, what are we going to do if and when there's a compact violation? Under the assumption that at some point we were going to violate the compact and we were going to be required to curtail water uses. And if that were to happen, if there were a violation and there were actually enforcement of the compact, which, first of all, isn't going to happen for a long time, and I don't foresee that it's actually going to be, frankly, enforced in accordance to its literal terms, because that is an unacceptable outcome both for the lower basin and the upper basin.
Can you just take a moment and what you mean by that loaded phrase there?
Compact call?
Yes. Well, a compact call or violation,
Yeah.
literal terms.
So the upper basin states of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico are required to not deplete the flow of the Colorado River essentially at Lake Powell, just below Lake Powell, below a certain level over a 10-year running average. If the flow drops below that point, then in theory, the California, Arizona, and Nevada could force a curtailment or reduction in use in all post-compact, post-1928 water rights in the upper basin until that flow gets returned to that level. So that means any water right that's junior to that date, which happens to include the vast majority of Denver Water's water rights and the vast majority of other Trans Mountain water rights. So from Denver's perspective, If that were to happen, we lose essentially half of our water supply. We get about half our water supply from the Colorado River, half our water supply from the South Platte River. So in theory, we're cut by 50% in terms of our water supply. And that is obviously of concern, and moreover, as Eric indicated, if that supply is threatened, we've got nothing to reuse. So if we spend a few $1 billion on the ability to maximize our reuse of that water, and we lose that water supply, we're stranded from a lot of different perspectives, financially as well as from a water supply perspective. So it's in our interest, and I think it's in the West Slope's interest and Colorado's interest as a whole, to protect those post-compact water uses, to move beyond thinking about what we will do if there's a compact violation, and develop a strategy to avoid a compact call from happening in the first place. Let's just not even allow ourselves to get there. And so the River District, Denver Water, a number of different entities are working with the basin states to actually develop that strategy. We've looked at modeling at Lake Powell, which is essentially the Upper Basin's bank account for providing for that compact compliance. And we are looking at moving water from upper federal reservoirs, down to Lake Powell to protect against essentially a violation of critical water levels. And we're also looking for ways to reduce demands in the basin to allow us to essentially manage within our means to avoid a compact call from happening in the first place. And that will give everybody security. It will, first of all, give the Front Range the security to know that we can make investments in reuse and maximize the use of our Colorado River supplies and not have to develop additional transmountain diversion. It also provides security to the West Slope in terms of future economic opportunity. If you look at the tie-in between Summit County and Denver, for example, if we got to that situation of a compact call, it's not just Denver, but Dillon Reservoir is going to be empty at that point. What does that do to the economy in Summit County? And so the consequences are so enormous, even though the probabilities are low, that we have to have a strategy for compact security.
Eric.
Yeah, and that's basically the paradigm shift that I was discussing, where we're now, through the State Water Plan, through the discussions by the Interbasin Compact Commission, to our own conversations among the upper division states, we're looking at how we can develop that surplus water in a way that provides that security for existing uses. So I talked about the definition of surplus has sort of changed from one that you on the East Slope can have water that's surplus to our economic needs, which was the Senate Document 80, the CP Colorado Big Thompson project model, to now being how do we collectively provide certainty for all of us in a way that allows us to continue to develop some increment of new water, whether it's on the East Slope or West Slope, and doesn't create this unacceptable risk in the future. But I totally agree with Jim. I think the concept of a compact curtailment is out there. It's real, but it'll never happen because the conditions that would require it are so dramatic and so already reservoirs are going to be dry. It's just a situation that we can't allow ourselves to get to, and we wouldn't. So we'll avoid it. And so how are we going to now operate in the system, as we call it, in a way that gives us that certainty upstream? And we're working on it, and I'm optimistic we'll be able to do that, and we'll be able to do that in a way that preserves the opportunity for the Front Range to maximize their reuse potential and to provide some additional water supplies where they're needed and when they're needed on both the East Slope and the West Slope.
Both of you have touched throughout our discussion so far on uncertainty and the various kinds of uncertainty, and I'd like us to focus on that in the last portion we have. There's climate uncertainty, there's federal regulatory uncertainty, perhaps some other kinds of uncertainties. there's also the question of return flows in the South Platte and uncertainties associated with the supply. Jim, how do you sort these out, and how do you see these? And are they the same kinds of uncertainty, or what's your notion?
No, they're different. I mean, and I think that part of what we learned, for example, in the Colorado River, is that the system, in essence, turned much more quickly than any of us really anticipated. I think that those of us who worked on the Colorado River, for example, knew, and in fact, the Central Arizona project was premised on the fact that there wasn't enough water in the river to satisfy that project, and they assumed that the federal government was going to pay for a giant project to import water from the Northwest and supplement their supply. Well, of course, that didn't happen, and it's not going to happen. So now that the lower basin has this deficit, but the last 14 years have demonstrated that droughts and extended droughts can have a very quick and devastating impact. So in addition to the uncertainties that you mentioned and perhaps related to climate change, we're I think, going to see deeper swings that certainly we have experienced in terms of hydrology and climate. Whether that means drier or wetter future, we don't know, but we definitely know it's going to get warmer. But the bottom line is we're going to have to be more adaptable. We're going to have to be more nimble. And my concern is that from a legal, political, regulatory perspective, we're not equipped to deal with not only the risks that we face, the speed at which we're going to be able to react to them, but also we're just not going to be able to have the institutional mechanisms in place to be able to deal with it. I'm concerned that for example, if you look at the regulatory environment, we're more than 10 years into a permitting process for the enlargement of Gross Reservoir. In the wake of the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, in the wake of an agreement with Grand County, Trout Unlimited, American Rivers, a number of environmental organizations on a mitigation package that everybody supports for that project. The enhancements that are provided by that, we are still in the midst of this endless regulatory process. The state Clean Water Act laws are premised on, for example, on temperature, are premised on temperature parameters that are not climate ready. They presume that in essence the climate is not going to get warmer, and so it's the responsibility of existing users to essentially protect something that is certainly beyond our control. We're looking at mitigation in terms of climate change and how we're going to adapt to it, but we are in a reactive mode to that. How we react to watershed health, for example, is another implication of climate change and the kinds of catastrophic wildfires that we've seen. We're very proactive in terms of working with the Forest Service and private landowners on forest health and watershed health. We just need, I think, we need to and part of the state water planning process should look across the board, not at just the simple question of meeting a water supply gap, but what are our strategies for being able to deal with the uncertainties that we're going to face in the future across all of these ranges, and our ability to meet the values that are set forth in the governor's executive order of a healthy economy, vibrant cities, great recreational opportunities, and agricultural economy that's vibrant.
Before I ask you to comment on this too, Eric, I'm going to throw in one of my biases, if you will. I feel as though the water law system and the infrastructure, both physical and administrative, was designed to manage risk. And there's a fundamental difference between risk management and decision making under uncertainty. And and both of you are now engaged in this process that involves these various kinds of uncertainty. You, Jim, have talked about whether or not the law handcuffs you, though that's not your word, I don't believe, in terms of dealing with the future. Eric, how do you see this?
Well, I would agree with you, Dan, that the water law is designed to deal with uncertainty, but I would also say that one of those underlying principles to the water development or resource development in the past that is no longer valid is a concept I call stationarity. When you think of hydrology, you can think we know what a stream. We can go out and we can gauge a stream for 50 years, and we can with that 50 years of gauging, we can know what the average flow is, and we can know what some of the highs and the lows, and we can get a picture of how often you can expect a drought. And with that, you can impose Colorado, sort of a Colorado water law system on it, and you can design your system. Well, I don't know that stationarity was ever there, but let's assume that it was. What we've seen recently is that you can't do that anymore. So you can't go out and rely on your understanding of the system for the last 100 years and say that's how it's going to operate in the future. So now you've got to design new mechanisms to say, what if there are changes that are beyond what I've seen in the past? And I think that's true of water quality, that's true of water quantity, and that's certainly what's handcuffing us in the regulatory arena. I think that regulatory atmosphere was designed to protect, in effect, to protect that stationarity. It was to protect the water quality that was there 50 years ago, and the stream that was there 50 years ago, not the one that might be there 50 years from now had we not even done anything because of the change around it. So it's going to be interesting for the water community in the next, the challenges that our successors are going to have are going to be very different than the ones that we were dealing with 40 years ago, and we're just starting to make that transition into how do we deal with a world where we really can't reliably predict what's going to be happening in our environment and what's going to be happening in our watersheds in the future.
No, I'll say this as a water lawyer, but the handcuff is really paralysis by analysis. Every potential change in how we deal and how we manage has to be looked at to the nth degree about how it's going to affect return flows and how it's going to affect this or that parameter of water use. And as a result, we sit around, we wring our hands for 10 or 15 years, wondering about what all the implications of what if we did this thing. I think we need to break the mold. We need to try piloting a number of different approaches in a much more flexible way, and realize that the world will not end if somehow we're able to try some things out and manage things in a different way. Because we can always go back to the old way, but I think that we've got to break that paradigm and begin to experiment. There's a lot of talk about, for example, alternative transfer mechanisms for agriculture. We've never actually done those. It's not been demonstrated that in Colorado they can work because we continually sit around and or sit at the legislature and argue about all the various possible ramifications of it. Somehow we need to break that mold and achieve a better way to try out different methodologies so we can have more flexibility in terms of the way we manage water.
Do you feel as though you're constrained by the water law, you're constrained by physical infrastructure, constrained by attitudes, or fears?
Probably by the politics, by attitudes, by the law and the regulatory structure more than the existing infrastructure. I think that, for example, rainwater capture. If we were able to look more holistically at the urban water cycle, from stormwater management to groundwater recharge and treatment and infiltration to water capture, to recycling and reuse and look at that entire cycle, we could use our water supplies in the South Platte Basin much more efficiently, which would be in the interest of the West Slope. But we can't do that under today's regulatory framework, in water law framework. So I think we need to, instead of getting hung up on what the law is and what are the ramifications, the law is designed to serve society rather than vice versa. And so we need to envision what that future is going to be and then adapt our laws and policies to realize that future.
Very
Dan,
good.
just
a quick comment. Then
yeah,
we'll
just
take some
real
more
quickly,
questions.
if I could add, if the state water plant could do one thing, it would do what Jim just said. It would provide a challenge to us into the future to break the mold and to try and not be captured by the past, if you want to call it. And as he said, we should, the law should serve us, not vice versa. And so far, I'll be a critic of the plan and say I think it falls short in doing that.
We'll come back to you on that if we have time. More questions?
Yes. So our next question is from Melanie Whiting, and she says, the Colorado Water Plan discusses streamlining of state permitting processes for water development projects. What do you see as the role and advantages of early stakeholder involvement, including involvement by local government and conservation interests?
We started with you last time on a question, Jim. Eric, we'll start with you here.
Well, I'd say they're already there, and they have been. I can't think of a project that we've moved forward that hasn't had a lot of people at the table up front. The question is, how do we reach agreement up front? In other words, how do we move the process forward in a way that you can reach some principles early on, and then keep to those principles. So that all of those stakeholders that Melanie mentions are at the table and stay at the table.
And to me, I'll go back to the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement and the Windy Gap firming agreements, and the approach that Denver Water took was before we launch into the permitting decisions, we need engagement. We need to sit down. And so I think to Melly's question, it's probably more important that if we're going to have a streamlined process and actually be able to make decisions, it's incumbent on whoever is promoting a water development project to sit down and engage at the front end. And certainly you're not going to satisfy 100% of everybody. We're not going to go out and have public hearings and have everybody cheering because this is a great thing. But I think what's been demonstrated by the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement is that there was a commitment by the West Slope, there was a commitment by Trout Unlimited, there was a commitment by Denver Water to sit at the table, to stay at the table until we reached agreement. And now, but the problem is, now that we've reached agreement, now that the involved stakeholders have been engaged and believe that we have the best product that we could have developed, we're still sitting here waiting for the permitting process to grind its way through the regulatory environment. It's not a question of short shrifting the analysis and short shrifting the engagement. But the challenge that we have is we have to march sequentially through various agencies to get various permits, whether that's the Corps of Engineers or the Forest Service or FERC or the CDPHE. We have to we can't just deal with them even in one bucket and have one collaborative decision even by those agencies. Everybody's got to up the ante as we go through these various hoops, and so there's got to be a better way to structure this, and to do so, I think that it puts more responsibility on the Denver Waters of the world to do that engagement up front and early.
Fiona?
This question is from Ramsey Crops. To follow up on Jim's comments, since agriculture uses between 80 and 90% of water in Colorado, isn't our effort best spent to find significant conservation in the agricultural use sector? what are some really good strategies for conserving uses in agriculture?
Jim.
Well, certainly, cities get a lot of feedback, I'll call it, that if we would only conserve more, then all our problems would go away. State water, the gap, just pull out bluegrass and we're done. Not quite as simple as that. I think that the risks and the challenges that we have articulated today demonstrate that we need a multi-pronged strategy. We need kind of all of the above. And that goes across all water use sectors. Denver Water serves 25% of the state's population. We only use 2% of the state's water. We need to think about ways to not necessarily conserve water or take water away from agriculture, but ways to incentivize more efficiency within the agricultural community. I think that if we look more broadly across all water use sectors and we think about overall water use efficiency, it's not going to take that much, frankly, to really move the needle in terms of our ability to more flexibly manage water. So whether it's financial incentives, whether it's developing some market-driven mechanisms to allow agricultural producers to use water more efficiently. Certainly we need to eliminate the perception that somehow a farmer's water right is threatened if the farmer uses less water or uses water more efficiently, which is the perception today, and that's why we can't get a law through the legislature and to the governor that incentivizes conservation in the agriculture community. It's another example of how water law is really handcuffing our ability to more flexibly manage. So I think there are a lot of opportunities to work with the agricultural community to use water more efficiently.
Eric, I like your answer too, but I'd like you to, if you have a west slope perspective here, or what are the issues in the west slope with ag conservation that are different from what you might find in the South Platte Basin?
One of the differences, as we see this all the time, and it's a struggle, is the understanding the difference between efficiency and conservation, if you want to call it. If the goal is reducing consumptive use, we've worked with a lot of our irrigation districts to improve our efficiency, to improve the ability to use water, but the end result is the consumptive use, what they're actually taking from the stream, is going up. They're now getting 3 cuttings of alfalfa as opposed to 2 because they make better, because they have better, more efficient delivery systems, or they can make their irrigation water go further. Their storage water. So there's this question of what's efficiency, and then what's from a West Slope perspective, and looking at the Colorado River issues, the end game is consumptive use. And we can be very efficient. We can be more efficient, and we will be more efficient, but that doesn't necessarily mean our consumptive use will be going down. It may be going up on existing irrigation. And then we just need to understand that's a difference between, say, the West Slope and perhaps some of the complex interconnection between the East Slope and the downstream Platte River irrigators.
I just want to follow up that a bit. And why is that the case on the West Slope as opposed to the South Platte? Does it have to do with return flows and what's downstream, or what?
It has to do with return flows and what's downstream. And it has to do with the reality on the West Slope that there aren't as many people downstream as there are on the Platte, and many of the mechanisms, the ability, the many diverters on the West Slope, for example, have traditionally diverted 10 acre-feet of water for every acre-feet they might consume. They didn't do that they don't do that on the Platte because years ago. They decided they needed to become more efficient. But if you're on the White River and the downstream Utah, the downstream user is in Utah, or there is no downstream user, then you don't have that economic incentive to do it. So there is a difference based on geography between West Slope and East Slope there.
We're reaching the end here now. We wanted to set aside 5 minutes for summaries, but we've spilled over our question period a little bit. So you're going to have to compress your summary remarks somewhat. And Jim, will start with you and then Eric.
Yeah.
So talk fast and don't say much.
Well, it's easy for me to not say much. harder for me to talk
Yeah.
fast. I think that I'll go back to the state water plan, and there's been a lot of talk, at least in the press, about the 7 principles and the prospect of a large trans-mountain diversion, and whether we're under risk under the compact, and whether we have water, and it's a lot of hyperbole. But I think at the end of the day, the direction that we need to head in terms of successfully implementing the state water plan and actually developing an action agenda which implements some of the things that are talked about in the plan, is to be able to roll up our sleeves and sit down and actually negotiate, as opposed to pontificate, about what are the strategies that we're going to be able to put in place as a state, in the interest of the state as a whole, to realize those values that are articulated in the governor's executive order. It's not as simple as saying we just need another Trans Mountain diversion project. It's not as simple as saying we can't move water from ag to urban. It's not as simple as saying cities just need to conserve more. There's a lot of hard work, and there are a lot of, I think, regulatory and legislative changes that are going to have to be put in place, and we're going to have to be brave enough to try and implement those. Otherwise, we will be stuck in the past, and we won't be able to control our future.
Thank you.
Well,
Eric, the last word.
The last word will be, I think, the state water plan, as Jim said, should promote action as opposed to continued paralysis. I do think we have a good understanding of what the problems are. It's created a foundation, and now it really should challenge us to move forward on those projects that are not achievable, and it should dismiss those where we don't have a strong consensus, like a $10 billion pumping plant from Maybell back to the Front Range, and should really focus on those things that can be achieved and challenge us to move forward on them.
Thank you both. I always learn something when I sit down and listen to the two of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it.
How much over are we?
Good job.
Thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks.
Jim.
Thanks.